Hello everyone, and welcome to this session about moving your class components to functional components inside React 16. In this session, I will try to make sense of the latest functionality that React has to offer. So if you already were using React in the past in SharePoint Framework, you probably mostly used class components. And during this session, I will try to show you what functional components are and how you can extend them with hooks in order to get the same kinds of functionality like you had in class components. But first of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Elio Struyf, I'm from Belgium, live near Antwerp, and I'm working as the engineering lead at Valo. These days I also run a sticker shop together with Louise Friese, which is called PYOD, or also known as Pimp Your Own Device. So always feel free to come by if you like stickers. We have a lot of great stickers in our shop. And besides the sticker business, beside my actual daily work, I also do a lot of blogging. I'm on Twitter, and if you have questions after this session, feel free to reach out on my email address. So before we dive into the content of this session, I want to thank all the sponsors of making these events happen. So without sponsors, we couldn't do these kind of things. So thank you all. And let's now dive into the topic. So where shall we start? Most of the time it's a good idea to start with an history lesson. So that's also what I'm going to do. So when we were using SharePoint Framework in the beginning, SharePoint Framework came with a particular older version of React. And in that version, you had two types of components that were available. The first one were functional components, and I don't know if you actually used functional components, because by default, SharePoint Framework in React, we're going to give you class components, and many of them just use them, and nothing wrong with that. But there were also functional components. And what is actually a functional component? A function component is a component that retrieves some data, some properties, and is going to give you HTML back. So it's a very simple component. You can look at it like a pure function. So you get data in and you get data out, and it doesn't do tremendous work behind the scenes because it doesn't have any state. It doesn't have any lifecycle hooks. So lifecycle hooks, like in a class component, component did mount, component did update, these kind of things, they don't exist in a function component. So why is a function component then being used? Actually, the function component was being used for just if you want to show something, the visualization of your data. So you could prepare everything inside the class component and let the class component render your function component. So these very simple, dumb components that then can be used. But what is state? So as a function component doesn't have a state. What is a state actually? A state is, you can see it as the brain or the memory from your component. So if the component needs to do something, like for instance, calling an API to retrieve data, and you need to store that somewhere, you can store it in the state of your current component so that it knows what to do. Like for instance, this traffic lights. Right now, my component knows, for instance, that the traffic light is on green. And from the moment it gets a trigger and it gets to orange, then it updates the state and it's going to say, hey, state, I want to have my traffic light to orange. So this is what the state is doing. It's the memory of its current components so that it knows, okay, this is what I need to render. And every time the state is going to change, it's going to re-render the component. So a function component sample, and if we're not yet talking about the state, looks like this. So it's a very simple thing. So you import React, an interface if you want to have an interface, and over here I specify session as my component name, and the only thing that it does is it returns. So this is an arrow function. And the only thing that the arrow function are some properties, if there are properties, but as you can see right now, the interface is empty, so there are no properties that are specified. And then it's going to just return a paragraph with session title will be added here. Nothing very fancy, but this is a very simplistic way of writing a component. Now, besides your function components, you had these class components. And these class components, they were introduced as an ECMAScript 6 standard way of using classes. So we were used to TypeScript. So in TypeScript, yes, we write classes, but actually it comes from ECMAScript 6. That's the standard where JavaScript is based on. And we were using the React.component class to extend it for our own component creation. And the great thing about class component was that it came with lifecycle hooks, so that you knew whenever this component was mounted on the page, whenever this component was being updated, would it be even a property change or a state change, this method was going to trigger. And this state is very important when you want to have that memory or that brain capacity inside your components. So if you go back to the sample that we had before, we just showed that it was a function that returned a string. Now in this class component, it's very similar, but you see two new things. So here, two interfaces, a properties properties interface and a state interface. And here you have the class session component, which extends from React component with properties, with a state. And then in here, the only thing that is required is a render. Now I specified that there were other lifecycle hooks, and I will talk more about them later in the demo, but over here, it only requires you to render something, but it's already different. Before it was just returning something, now it's giving you a render method, and the class component knows that, oh, this is what I need to do. I need to always call my render function in order to render. So in this case, they are not really different. So why should you care? Actually, the reason why you should care is that function components are lighter, are faster, because you're not extending from a class. So a function component is just a function, a method that you're going to execute and return some data. So data in, HTML out. Also, function components are pretty easy to write because there's no logic in them besides the visualization of the things that you want to show. And as I already mentioned, function components are often used for the presentation layer of your applications. So why class components then? Because class components are necessary if you want to maintain a state. So let's do a demo around this. So in this demo, I'm going to just showcase what a function component is and what a class component is. So in the first demo, what I'm going to show is what are class components and what are function components. So here on the left side, you see actually the demo that I typically use. I adapted it a little bit for this session, but over here, you have some guys and girls that can be shown. I can change the web part type and I can say girl, and then everyone will become a girl, or if I change that back to boy, then it will become a boy at the top. This one is being done or being achieved via an API call, but more on that later. So what do we have inside our web parts? So inside our web parts, I used React, and by default, it gives me a class component. So I already put in the logic for the class component, but I want to more focus on the rendering part of it. So in the rendering, I do these two things like type, and I have an async type as well. Type comes from props and the async type comes from the state. And I actually do the same thing twice. So if you want to reuse the things that you already have. What you then can do is create new components. And if we want to create a new component, that's something we can do with creating a new file and then saying persona.tsx, because I won't want to initialize or recreate the HTML for each person again and again and again, what I've done right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that's RCC, and that's going to create my class components. So how you know that is because it's class persona, and then it's going to return a public render method. So in here, what I can do is take this HTML and put it in here. Oh, it's going to say, hey, there's something wrong. So that's because there's no root element. So either we can leave these elements there, or we can just remove them, and then it's a fragment that we are going to return. So then React at least has a root element. Still, there are problems, and these are coming from the style. So I need to provide these custom styles. In order to do that, I'm going to write some properties. So class name is a property that I require, and that should come there. So in this case, I'm going to retrieve my properties. So I'm going to say class name is this dot props, and then I'm going to do this. So then class name should already be fixed. Then the next thing is a type. So type is normally coming from the state. So I want to have now type coming from my properties, and I do the same thing here and here. The reason why I do that is because this is just cleaner. Then I can just write type instead of every time accessing the state object and then retrieving the type from that. So now we have a persona object, and this persona object allows us to simply do this thing. So I can use persona, no, not from Office UI Fabric. I want to have persona from my own code base, and class name is style common. And then we have also the type. And what is the type? The type comes from our state. There you go. And we need to do that one time. That's more than enough. And this is now done for our web part. So if I'm going to refresh over here, you see everything keeps on rendering. We can change it to the above code as well. So if we do this, there
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
That was my Siri. So it's actually funny that for some reason Siri reacted on it. So I can say boy, and I can say girl in here, because with all we need to render them ourselves. So class component. Now class component is typically used when you need that state. So in this case, no state is being used. So it's a bit stupid actually to write a class component if we just want to render something. So what you can do, and let me first refresh so that you can see that it still works. What you can do is you can say SPFX, and I'm going to write my function component. Let me check. I probably did something wrong. Persona, same thing. And then the only thing I need here, need from that is that I put this one in. I can remove all of that, and I don't need to have a state either. So here I'm going to use props. So I can deconstruct name equals to props, and I need to do props. And I need to do the same thing for my type. There you go. And now we used just a functional component. As you can see, this is an arrow function, retrieves the properties and then returns these properties. And when we are now going to go back, I didn't use a default export, so that's why it's going to complain. And whenever this is finished, then it should be ready to go. And then we can refresh the page. So now we can refresh the page and you see everything is still working. So persona is now being used as of a functional component. So I'm now going to do the same thing for the async type. So I'm going to skip this from the recording so that you don't have to wait for that. So there you go. So the class component now uses these personas everywhere. So class components can use a state, and this is where typically a constructor comes in. So in here you set this.state, then you specify the initial state. So for me, my type is null, or my async type is null, and then I set loading. So if I refresh here, you see a quick spinner. That's because my loading will be set to true whenever my component mounts. So then it's going to get my latest settings from the site, and the same thing when my component updates, it's going to also try to retrieve the settings because of the property change that checks if my type is not the same and if it's actually a right type. So what happens behind the scenes? In here I have a list, briquettes, and in that list there is a field. And if I set this field, for instance, now to all, and I go back to the home page, now it retrieves all the images for me. And that's being done by this simple method where I'm doing an API call to give me all the give me the last modified item and set the async type to the type that you had in the list. And this is where you set the state. So 2 times. Why? Because if it doesn't contain any data, then still the loading needs to be stopped. And in here I set the type of my async action, and that's where you see all of them appearing. So now it contains that state, and now it knows what to do, and this state can then be passed on over to the persona. So in this demo, I showed what a function component and what a class component actually are and how you can combine them together. Now, in React version 16.8, which is now also being used inside SharePoint Framework, hooks were introduced. And hooks, we hear so many things about hooks. And yes, hooks are great. And it's not only a hype, they are pretty important. But why are they actually there? So what are these hooks and why should you even care if you already knew class components? So first of all, a hook lets you hook into a state of a component, and actually the function component. And that means that you don't need to write class components to do state management inside your components. This is a pretty new thing. So as I said before version 16.8, the only way to manage this, to have a state management inside your component, was if you were going to use class components, because function components didn't have a state. Now with these hooks, you can add the capability to your function components in order to get a state inside these components. That's pretty easy, and I will showcase that. And that's also why React went for this approach, because they heard a lot of feedback that developers, or more on the JavaScript side of things, were not being used of using classes. Like if you were already a TypeScript developer or a C# developer, then classes are pretty often used and known inside the object-oriented world. But in JavaScript, you mostly like to use functions. And then you already know these functional capabilities. But if you were going to move to classes, then all of a sudden you needed to learn something new, so to say. So what kind of advantages does hooks bring to your components? First of all, it's a cleaner component. A cleaner component, I mean less code to write in there. So no complex lifecycle logic. So sometimes it could have been that you had these very hard things to solve, like in the beginning when I started using class components, you had component will mount, component did mount, component will update, and component did update. And then we were just using them all in one component, and we were doing checks. If this changes, then that. If that changes, then this, and so on and so on and so on. Over time, they said, okay, component will update or will mount are some things that are legacy or is considered to be unsafe. So we are not going to allow you or going to prevent you to use that. So these days you only have component did update and component did mount there. So, but still it can be quite complex because every time your component is going to re-render or every time you're going to push new data via props or via state, it will or it can trigger these lifecycle hooks. And then depending on what are in these lifecycle hooks, the complexity can be challenging. Also, hooks is pretty easy to learn because yet again, it's just a function which you extend with a couple of other functions. And I'm going to show that in order to show you that these kind of things are not rocket science and it's not something you need to be afraid of into learning these new capabilities. So what are these hooks? These hooks are actually just functions. And these three functions that you see over here, use state, use effect, and use context, are the three oftenly used hooks inside React. There are a couple of others which I'm not going to highlight because these are the three most ones that you're going to use. So use state, simple state management inside your components. It's actually the same thing that you did in class components. Like in class components, you did this dot state for initializing your state in the constructor. And then you did this dot set state in order to update your state whenever it changed. Very similar here. But you're now using use state, and it's a very simplistic way of updating a state here. Use effect is to allow side effects. Like, what is a side effect? It's when you, for instance, need to do an API call and need to retrieve data in order to set the states. So what you typically do inside these lifecycle hooks, like if my component did mount, then I need to call an API to retrieve the data, set the data in my state, and so on. These things can now be done inside a use effect method. Use context. If you were using React 15 or so, React always said, don't use a context. Now in React 16, this is different. In React 16, you can have an overall global context, which you can then use within your components, so that the components are aware of a global context or a global state. Very easy to use and also a very nice way for passing information from one component to another on a global level. And every time that context is going to change, also the component can be re-rendered on it. Now, there are a couple of rules, and that's why you need to play by the rules. And what are these rules? These rules are the following. So rule number one is these hooks should always be at the top of your components. So why? Because it simply doesn't work if they are in a loop, in a condition, or somewhere else in your code. So every time you create or you want to use a hook, you need to allow them or you need to set them at the top. Only use them in components. Yeah, it doesn't make any sense to use them anywhere else. But if you, for instance, want to try to use them in a JavaScript function, that's not going to work and that's not allowed. So don't use them in class components, don't use them in regular JavaScript functions. Where you can also use hooks is in custom hooks. So you can create your own kind of hooks, and the reason why is to create reusable functionality so that you don't need to do the same thing all over again and again and again. For instance, a custom hook could be use SharePoint API, so that you just pass in a URL, the hook retrieves the information from the API, returns the data, and that's it. So that way, it's a very simplistic way of reusing your code within multiple components. So if you know these rules, that's good, but you don't need to be afraid that all of a sudden you need to move all your class components over to function components. The React team made the statement that class components are not going to be removed. They will stay for a very long time. So it's not that they just invented something new to remove the older things, because class components still have their needs, and a lot of companies, a lot of solutions are still using class components. So if you want to work on a new project, think about it as you can go for the full hooks approach. But if you have an older project to maintain, maybe you need to think it or go for the hooks approach for new components. But for the older one, you can still use class components. And from the moment you have time for refactoring, that's maybe also the time to move or migrate your class components over to function components. But don't go in a hurry and say, oh no, I need to do all at once. So all class components need to be moved over to function components. No, that's not a necessity. So you don't have to worry about that. So in order to proceed, let's go into a demo around hooks and what hooks can offer to you. In this second demo, I'm going to show how you can use hooks inside your functional components. So for that, I'm going to remove a couple of things. So if we set this, so what will happen is that I'm only passing the type to my persona. But inside the persona now I need to create my own state because of setting the two images correctly. So that's what we have here. So what I want to do is that I don't have to do this thing twice. So for that I need to have a state. And if you want to have a state inside a functional component, we need to use the useState hook. And you do that via creating a new state, and I'm going to use state, and I will create an empty array, and then it's going to output me an array of two things. First of all is the values, so the value object, and then the second one is a callback function or a function to update the current state of the persona component, set personas. And this is actually how the useState hook works. So you have the value and then you have the updates. So here, if I'm going to write this, I can say map and I can say persona. And I'm going to output this like that. And persona needs to then just be here. And one can then be removed. Closing the fragments like this. So right now, this won't do anything because the personas are empty by default. So if I was going to refresh the page, and I can actually do that whenever my web part is done for rendering, then you will see that it's still empty. Now, when we want to update this state, you need to have something. So you need to have a side effect happening. And we are going to listen to the type. So every time the type is going to change, then we want to actually update the personas. And how to do that is via the use effect. So in here, we are going to write use effects, and use effects requires a callback function. And then a second one is an array of dependencies to which is going to listen. So if you just want to do on the component mount or did mount, then you can just write an empty string and then it will only run once. In here, I'm interested in type. So every time the type is going to change, then I want to use this effect. So it's going to do something. And what are we going to do? We are going to set the persona types, and then we are going to set the type to the boy and the girl or all. So here I can do if type equals to all. Then I want to set my persona to, and yeah, let's do boy 1, boy 2, and I see that I'm missing some things here, and I'm going to do the same for girl 1 and girl 2. If not, then we are just going to set personas, and I'm going to copy paste this. Actually, I didn't have to do that. So I just do type, and then 1. And for some reason I overwritten something, and then 2, and that's actually it. So now when I save, so what happens is when my persona card is going to render, then it's going to set the state to empty. It's going to listen to type changes. Whenever the type is going to change, then it's going to say, hey, this is going to render or set the personas. And then from the moment my personas are set, then it's going to render something. So in here, you can already see that the girls are there because of in my list there was set to all. So if I say girl in here and go back, then they are being updated. So this is a very simplistic way of updating your state with hooks inside a functional component. So that was a demo about how you can use hooks within your functional components to manage the state of that component. So very nice and easy to do. Next thing is how to actually migrate away from that class component to a functional component. In order to do that, we have to do a lot of work on the lifecycle methods, because that's where most of the logic of class components is in. These lifecycle methods, what are they? That are the component did mount, component did update, and so on. That's what we need to move away over to a functional component, because that doesn't exist anymore. You also see some unsafe ones that are the ones that are labeled unsafe today. In the past, you could use them. So best to not use them anymore. But if you want to move, there's only one method that you need to use, or one hook that you need to use, and that's the use effect hook. So the use effects mostly does the same thing what has been shown in the list next to it. So all of that can be replaced by the use effect. And of course, you need to do some work for that. And that's what I'm going to showcase inside this demo on how to migrate from classes to functions. In this demo, I'm going to do the migration part. So here we have the normal class component, and what I already did is configure my web part to make use of the briquette hook component. So right now it doesn't really render anything because nothing is there, so it's just empty. So if you want to migrate, then we need to check all of these things. So what I'm going to do is right now, I will just copy paste what is inside my render functionality, and I will paste it over and I will put it here. So this is already going to work if I'm pasting in all the styles. But here you see loading state. Yeah, there is no state. So we are going to expect a loading value, and we set loading over here from state. And this is where we can specify a default value. Spinner needs to be included. So it's coming from Office UI Fabric. The size of the spinner also needs to be included. And then there are a couple of other things like the persona cards. And we have this .state.type. This is now coming from props. So we can actually do props.type. And here we have an async type. And that was coming from our API call, async type. And our async type is set to empty right now, so we don't need to do that. So let's do this, prop type, and then async type is that. So if we are going to re-render this, at least it should show the persona card for the type from properties and not the one from async type, because it's not there yet. So that's what you can see over here. So the next thing what we need to do, so typically what happens is your component is going to mount, and then we were going to do these changes. So you can copy paste this as well. So what I'm going to do is do this, and that becomes a bit interesting. So here in my component again, what we need to do is a side effect. So use effect. And then we need to write the callback function, and we also need to write on what we want to listen. So in this case, I just want to have it whenever it's going to render for the first time. I'm going to do that. So this is why I just add an empty string. And now here, what we can do, and let me create const function for it so that it's a little bit better, and we need to make it async because it's an asynchronous function, and it should be written like this. And then we have a couple of things as well that are still not correct. So the properties should be props. So this props doesn't exist because we're in the function. Then set state loading should set loading should be then true. So pretty easy here. This is where we are going to include SP contexts or the SPHP and clients. This logic all stays the same. And then set state for the async type. Here we do this. And we pass in the same thing like this check. Let's just leave the check for now and let's just put this one in. And it's all good. And then from the moment our API call is done, we set it to false. So now we need to call this. And one thing which is special is that inside this use effect, you cannot make this asynchronous because effect is always a synchronous callback. So if you want to do an async function, you just need to create a function first and make it async and then call it from use effect. So what I always do is like this. I create my function, an asynchronous function, and then inside my use effects, I'm just going to say, hey, get me these latest settings, and that will then work. So if everything is okay, and if I set everything correct, then from the moment my component is going to render, it's going to get my latest changes, set the type, and then at least at the bottom we should see that this is now becoming available, just to showcase that this is now also working. We can put all in there and we can go there. And now you see that the state changed with 4 of them. So this is how you migrate from a class component to a functional component. 60 lines, and before it was a lot more, 120. So you see that the logic is already a little bit easier to understand because of all these lifecycle hooks that are now not there anymore. So now that we migrated the class component over to a functional component, it's time to start talking about hooks and creating custom hooks especially. So now I'm going to start building my own hook in order to reuse the functionality for calling the SharePoint API so that not every function needs to do that over and over and over again, but can just use that hook from the one that I create, just initialize that and start using it. So a custom hook is actually nothing more than a function, and that's what you see here is custom or use custom. You just give it a name and it can use a state. So here I initialize a value with a state for updating the value, and I initialize the state with an empty string. In here we use an effect, and also here we have the fetch data. So you see fetch data gets called, and every time the options change, it will reset or re-evaluate the use effects. So it will re-fetch the data, and at the end I'm going to return the value. And this value is the value that is actually going to be used inside your component. So a custom component or a custom hook is very simple to create as well, and easy to reuse inside other components. So that's actually it. So let's move on to the demo, and then I can showcase what you can do there inside the custom hooks. So in the last demo, I want to quickly highlight how you can create your own custom hook. So here we have an empty file. If I'm using my snippet for creating my custom hook, then you see a use state and use effects, and then it's going to return me some values. So what are we going to do here is we retrieve, or we are going to copy this. We are going to say that this is going to be our context that we are going to provide. We are going to remove React from it because I already imported them correctly. Here we are going to do this. So what we don't need anymore is the whole state management here. We put that one inside the fetch data. This is another way of writing it. So within the use effect, we have the fetch data. We call it over here. And right now in options, we say that it's going to listen to the context. And at the end of a custom hook, we just need to return what we are interested in. So we are interested in loading and the async type. So let me just do this. So that's it actually. A couple of imports that are still required, like the SPHP client. So the use custom hook is now going to listen from the moment you're going to use it. Then it's going to check the context. If the context is provided or changed, then it's going to do this, and it's going to return the loading and the state. So how do you use it here? Inside your brackets hook component, you actually open your curly brackets, and you can then say loading, and what was the other one? Async type. And where do we want to retrieve it from? We want to retrieve it from the custom hook. And we needed to provide props dot context, and that's actually it. So simple, but now you can reuse this part in each component where you want to leverage that custom hook. If I'm going to refresh my page, it hopefully still works. Did I forget something? Oh, I set loading to true and I set loading here needed to be false. And whenever my reload is done, now it works okay. If I'm going to brick it here, I'm going to change my list. I set it to boy, for instance, and I'm going back to home. You see that this has now been updated. So this was the demo. So I hope that you now understand what hooks are, how to create your own custom hooks, and how to migrate from class components. So that was actually it. So if you have any questions, feel free to contact me on various channels. So you can ping me on Twitter, you can go to my blog, put something in my contact form, or you can even send me an email. So that said, I hope you learned something from this session, and have a great day at the Scottish Summit. And hopefully next year we can see each other in real life. So for now, stay safe and have a great time at the event. Bye-bye.